Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going on a bit of a journey through a true crime case that I think will leave you really questioning everything you thought you knew. About justice and medicine and even motherhood, we're diving into the story of Waneta Hoyt,
Waneta Hoyt.
a seemingly ordinary housewife from upstate New York whose life took a very dark turn.
Yeah.
She was convicted of a horrific crime, but get this, years later, officially, she died an innocent woman.
Right.
How's that even possible? Well, that's what we're here to kind of try to unravel.
Yeah. It is a real head scratcher. And what makes this case, I think, so fascinating is how it unfolds like a puzzle. There are so many twists and turns, so many things that challenge our understanding, not just of the legal system, but even the nature of truth.
Right. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Waneta married Tim Hoyt in 1964, and they had what seemed like a typical large family, eventually having 7 children. But behind this facade of this happy family tragedy was brewing.
Yeah. Between 1965 and 1971, 5 of their biological children died in infancy, which tragic.
Heartbreaking. But then what makes it so complex is that initially, all of these deaths were attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIs.
Now, I know many of our listeners are familiar with the SIDS, but for those who aren't, it's essentially a diagnosis given when the cause of an infant's death can't be explained. And back then, SI days was even more of a mystery than it is today.
Oh, yeah.
So 5 infant deaths in a single family, that's statistically improbable, to say the least.
Extremely improbable. But at the time, no one suspected foul play, medical professionals were baffled.
Right.
And for over 2 decades, the case remained closed, considered a series of tragic, albeit extremely unusual coincidences.
Okay, so when did things start to change? When did people start to actually get suspicious about these deaths?
Well, the shift came in 1985.
Right.
A prosecutor in a neighboring county was working on a suspected SIDs case, and he consulted with Dr. Linda Norton, a forensic pathologist.
So like a medical detective.
Exactly. And she suggested something that sent chills down everyone's spines.
That a serial killer
Yeah.
might be operating in the area.
Whoa, okay, that definitely throws a whole new wrench into things. So what led her to that conclusion? Was it just a hunch, or was there something more concrete?
It wasn't just a hunch. She'd actually come across a research article
Okay.
from 1972, written by Dr. Alfred Steinschneider.
Okay.
Now, Steinschneider was a very prominent SIDS researcher.
Yeah.
And his article focused on, you guessed it, the Hoyt case. Now, the family wasn't named in this study to protect their privacy, but he was proposing a link between sleep apnea and SIDs, using the Hoyt children as subjects.
Interesting.
Now, his work was initially groundbreaking, but it would later come back to haunt this case.
So this research meant to shed light on SIDs actually ended up kind of obscuring the truth about what was happening in the Hoyt household.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It is. It really is. And it speaks volumes, I think, about the complexity of scientific research and how even well-intentioned research can be flawed or misinterpreted and have unintended or even dire consequences. What seemed like a breakthrough at the time would later be completely discredited, casting a whole lot of suspicion on the true nature of the Hoyt children's deaths.
This is already so twisty. So we've got a forensic pathologist suggesting a serial killer and a research study that turned out to be bogus. What happened next? Did the authorities immediately reopen the Hoyt case?
Not quite immediately.
Okay.
It wasn't until 1992 that a new district attorney, who had been alerted by Dr. Norton years earlier, decided to take a fresh look at the case.
Okay.
And he brought in another renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, to review all the evidence. And Dr. Baden's conclusion was like a bomb going off. He determined that the deaths were not natural.
Oh, wow.
They were homicides. And suddenly, a case that had been closed for decades was now a full-blown murder investigation.
Wow. That must have sent shockwaves through the community, especially for Tim Hoyt, Waneta's husband. All this time he had believed that his children died from a tragic medical condition, and now he's being told they were murdered.
Exactly. And the focus quickly turned to Waneta. I mean, who else would have had the opportunity? And perhaps more importantly, the motive to harm these infants.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how did they approach her? Did they just outright accuse her?
Not at first.
Okay.
In 1994, a state trooper actually went undercover, pretending to be conducting SID's research.
Wow.
He approached Waneta, hoping to gain her trust and get her talking about her children.
Oh, so it was like a cat and mouse game, a strategic move to get her to open up.
Exactly. And you wouldn't believe what happened next.
Wait, don't tell me. She confessed.
You got it. Waneta confessed to suffocating each of her 5 children.
Oh my God.
Her motive: She said she simply couldn't handle their crying.
I get chills just thinking about that. It's hard to even fathom a mother doing such a thing.
It's one of the most chilling aspects of this case for sure. 5 innocent lives. Eric, who was just 3 months old. James, 2 years old. Julie, who only laid for 3 weeks. Molly, who died at 3 months. And Noah, who passed away at just 2 months.
It's heartbreaking. And to think that their deaths were misdiagnosed for so long, it's just, wow.
Absolutely. But there's another layer to this confession that makes things even more complicated. Waneta later recanted her confession, claiming it was coerced.
Oh, wow. So is she a cold-blooded killer trying to save herself? Or is she a victim of a flawed system? I mean, what do you make of this?
That is the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and it's one that would become central to her trial.
Well, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Yeah. There's a lot more to unpack here.
All right, we'll be back.
Yeah.
All right, so we're back. And ready to dive into this trial of Waneta Hoyt. We left off with her confession, which she later recanted and said was coerced.
Right.
That just makes things even more complicated.
It does. It really adds, I think, another layer of complexity to this already complex case.
Yeah.
The trial, which started in 1995, really became a battleground over the validity of that confession.
Right. I mean, a confession is usually seen as pretty damning evidence.
Oh, absolutely.
So what did the defense argue to kind of counter that?
Well, they brought in an expert, Dr. Charles Patrick Ewing, who is a forensic psychologist specializing in false confessions, among other things. And he argued that Waneta's confession was involuntary, pointing to certain personality disorders she had that might have made her particularly susceptible to manipulation.
So they were basically saying that she was pressured or tricked into confessing to something she didn't actually do.
Exactly. They argued that the undercover trooper, while posing as this researcher, employed tactics that could be considered coercive, especially considering Waneta's mental state.
And of course, the prosecution had a different perspective. Did they just dismiss the idea of coercion altogether?
Not entirely. They brought in their own expert, Dr. David Barry, who acknowledged that certain police tactics could be considered questionable. But he still maintained that the confession was genuine. He argued that despite the trooper's methods, the details that she provided in her confession were too specific and accurate to have been fabricated.
So basically, you've got two experts, both credible in their own right, presenting completely opposing interpretations of the same confession. No wonder this case was so controversial. What did the jury ultimately decide?
The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution.
Wow.
And in September 1995, Waneta Hoyt was found guilty and sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, 15 years for each child. It seemed like the case was closed. Justice had been served. But as we said earlier, there are so many twists and turns in this story.
There always are. Okay, so lay it on me. What other bombshells are we waiting to hear?
Well, there's another element to this case that raises a whole new set of questions. Munchausen Syndrome by proxy.
I've heard of Munchausen Syndrome. What's this by proxy thing?
Yeah, it's a particularly disturbing form of abuse. Essentially, it's when a caregiver, usually a parent, either fabricates or induces illness in a child to gain attention and sympathy. It's often really difficult to detect because the perpetrator is often very good at manipulating medical professionals and appearing to be this very loving and concerned parent.
Yeah, it sounds terrifying. And some experts believe that Waneta might have suffered from this.
Yes, although it was never officially diagnosed. Looking back on the case, some experts have suggested that MSBP could explain her actions. The fact that she has so many children who all died under mysterious circumstances, coupled with her seemingly calm demeanor in the face of such tragedy, has led some to believe that this disorder was at play.
Okay, so we're potentially dealing with a case of murder, possibly a coerced confession, and then this controversial psychological disorder.
Right.
This is a lot. Did the possibility of MSBP come up during the trial at all?
It wasn't really a central focus of the trial.
Okay.
The prosecution really built their case on that confession, and the defense was focused on challenging its legitimacy. However, the possibility of MSBP does add, I think, another layer of complexity to understanding Waneta's actions and motivations.
For sure. It also makes you wonder about the initial medical investigations, if this was a factor. Were the doctors and the nurses who treated the Hoyt children just completely fooled?
It's a really valid point, and it underscores the fact that medical professionals are not infallible. They rely on the information they're given and can sometimes be misled, especially by a skilled manipulator. And back then, MSBP was not as well known or understood as it is today.
Right. So it's possible that a lack of awareness about this disorder might have contributed to the misdiagnosis of the children's deaths.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even in fields like medicine, where we expect a lot of expertise and objectivity, there's always room for human error, bias,
Yeah.
and the influence of prevailing beliefs.
Yeah.
And this case is, I think, a really stark example of how those factors can have devastating consequences.
Wow. It's kind of scary. It makes you think about how many other cases might be out there that have been misdiagnosed or misunderstood, especially before this was widely recognized.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the importance of continually questioning, researching, and refining our understanding of human behavior in both the medical and legal fields.
Absolutely. So with Waneta convicted and sentenced, it kind of seems like this story is coming to an end. But you said there were still more twists and turns.
Right.
What
Yeah.
happened next?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, Waneta maintained her innocence and was in the process of appealing her conviction. However, in a really tragic turn of events, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer while in prison.
Oh, no. So she was facing a terminal illness while fighting for her freedom.
She was. And sadly, she died in prison in August of 1998, just 4 years after her conviction. She never got to see her appeal play out.
So she died still claiming she was innocent.
She did. And because of a specific law in New York, her death before the appeal process concluded meant that her conviction was formally overturned.
Wait, so even though she was found guilty by a jury, legally she died an innocent woman.
That's right. In the eyes of the law, she was exonerated.
Mm.
It's a very strange twist of fate. And it leaves us with, I think, even more questions than answers.
Wow, this is like an onion. There are so many layers to this. I'm almost afraid to ask, but is there more?
There is. And this next part is particularly relevant, I think, to anyone who's interested in the intersection of science and justice.
Okay.
Remember Dr. Steinschneider,
Yes.
the SIDS researcher?
The one whose work kind of shielded Waneta's crimes for years.
Exactly. Well, his story doesn't end with his flawed research.
So what happened with Dr. Steinschneider after his research was discredited?
Well, you'd think that after being linked to such a high-profile case and having his work debunked, he would kind of fade into obscurity, right?
Yeah, you would think so, especially since his research, even though it was flawed, was used for years to explain away these deaths. It seems like he'd have some explaining to do.
You'd think so. But what's so shocking is that he continued to practice medicine and even continued to conduct SID's research.
Oh, wow.
And get this, he even receives funding from the National Institutes of Health.
Are you serious? That's unbelievable. Didn't anyone raise any red flags? How could he continue to be taken seriously in the medical community after all of this?
Yeah. So? It's baffling, isn't it? It makes you wonder how much scrutiny medical research really undergoes, especially back then.
Yeah.
And this case highlights, I think, another really fascinating aspect of this whole story, the power dynamics.
Yeah.
Steinschneider was such a leading figure in SID's research. People were hesitant to question his findings, even when doubts started to emerge.
It's like that classic the emperor's new clothes scenario. Everyone's afraid to point out that the emperor is naked. It just goes to show that even in science, reputation and authority can sometimes overshadow the truth.
Exactly. And what's even more unsettling is that Steinschneider himself seemed totally unfazed by the controversy surrounding his work. He remained completely adamant that his research was sound and that he had no involvement in any wrongdoing.
So he never admitted to any fault or expressed any remorse for the role that his research played in delaying justice for these children?
Not publicly, no. And it's a very perplexing and frustrating aspect of this case. It really leaves you wondering about accountability, ethics, and the responsibility that comes with conducting scientific research.
It really does. And it kind of brings us back to this bigger question that keeps popping up. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge and medical advancement with the potential for human error, bias, and even manipulation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers. But I think the Waneta Hoyt case serves as a powerful cautionary tale,
Right.
reminding us that we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question assumptions
Right.
and to demand transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to something as sensitive and impactful as medical research.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. This case really makes you realize that even fields like medicine, which we tend to hold to such a high regard, aren't immune to human fallibility.
Yeah. And it also highlights the importance of considering multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
If more people had been willing to question Steinschneider's findings early on, perhaps the truth about the Hoyt children's deaths would come to light sooner.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, but an important one. It also speaks to the value of diverse voices.
Well,
and viewpoints in any field, really.
absolutely. So to our listeners, if there's one thing you take away from this deep dive, let it be this. Question everything. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo, to dig a little deeper, and to seek out alternative perspectives. That's how we ensure that justice is served, that science progresses ethically, and that we all continue to learn and grow as a society.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered a lot of ground today. Murder, misdiagnosis, a controversial confession, a possible psychological disorder, the complex interplay between science and justice. This case had everything.
It did. But that's the nature of the deep dive, right? Exploring the layers, the nuances, the questions that linger, long after the headlines fade.
Exactly. The Waneta Hoyt case may be officially closed, but the questions it raises about truth, justice, and the very nature of human behavior remain open, and that's something we can all ponder, discuss, and continue to learn from.
I think you're right, and I'm sure our listeners have their own thoughts and theories about this case.
Oh, yeah.
It's the kind of story that sticks with you. You know, it prompts you to kind of re-examine your own assumptions and consider the complexities of the world around us.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, we leave you with this. What are your thoughts on the role of confession in criminal investigations? How do you balance the need for justice with the potential for error? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives going. Until next time.